The wind was a blade against Alara's cheek, sharpening the ache of a world turned to gray dust and brittle grass. It was a late autumn wind, carrying the scent of snow and the promise of a merciless winter across the vast, empty plains of Montana. Her land, 160 acres of sorrow and failed crops, was a testament to a year that had taken everything. It had taken her husband, Thomas, in a fever that burned through him in 3 short days, and now it was taking the last of her hope. The cabin, once a haven built with loving hands, felt like a tomb waiting to be sealed by the first blizzard. Its timbers groaned a constant lament, echoing the hollow space inside her chest. Every morning, she woke to the same cold dread, a physical weight that pressed down on her as she stared at the meager pantry shelves. The salt pork was gone. The flour was a pale ghost at the bottom of the sack. Hunger was no longer a distant threat. It was a quiet visitor who had taken a seat at her table. Today, however, brought a more immediate specter. Mr. Croft, the banker from town, had made the journey in his polished black buggy, a dark blot against the muted landscape. He stood on her porch, his face pinched with impatience, the foreclosure notice a stark white rectangle in his gloved hand. He did not need to speak the words aloud. They were written in the smug set of his jaw, in the way his eyes swept over the dilapidated fence line with undisguised contempt. He saw a problem to be tidied away, a failed venture to be liquidated. He did not see the splintered porch rail where Thomas had carved their initials, or the single stubborn rosebush she watered with tears. "It is a matter of business, Mrs. Thorne," Croft said, his voice as thin and dry as the rustling leaves. "The bank has been more than patient." Patience. The word was a cruel joke. Had the bank been patient when the rains refused to come? Had it been patient when the fever stole the strength from Thomas's body? She said nothing, her throat sealed tight with a grief too heavy for words. Her hands, chapped and raw from work that had yielded nothing, were clenched at her sides. She was cornered, the vast emptiness of the prairie offering no escape, only a more expansive prison. Just as Croft was turning to leave, a new shadow fell across the porch. It was long and imposing, cast by a rider who had approached with the silence of a predator. Silas Blackwood. The name was a whisper in town, a legend woven from fear and envy. He owned everything the sun touched in this valley, a vast empire of cattle and land that stretched to the jagged teeth of the mountains on the horizon. He was a man carved from the same hard granite as those peaks, isolated, weathered, and unmovable. He dismounted his great black horse, the animal's breath pluming in the cold air. Blackwood did not look at Croft. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, found Alara and held her fast. They were not unkind, but they were devastatingly direct, stripping away all pretense, seeing right down to the bone of her desperation. "Leave her be, Croft." Blackwood's voice was low, a rumble of stone on stone. It was not a request. Croft sputtered, his face flushing. "This is bank business, Blackwood. This property is forfeit." Blackwood took a step onto the porch. He was taller than she'd realized, a monolith of quiet power in a worn sheepskin coat. "I'm making it my business." He reached into his coat and produced a leather purse, tossing it to the banker. The weight of it, the solid, final thud of coin, made Croft's eyes widen. "That clears her debt. And mine. Now get off my land." The words hung in the air, cold and absolute. "My land." Croft snatched the purse and scurried back to his buggy, casting one last venomous look at Alara before whipping his horse into a frantic departure. The dust settled, leaving only the two of them in the vast, aching silence. Alara stared at Silas Blackwood, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and suspicion. Men like him did not perform acts of charity. His generosity was a stone that would sink her into a different kind of debt. "Why?" she finally managed to whisper, the sound fragile against the wind. He looked at her, his gaze unwavering. He took in her threadbare dress, the tremor in her hands, the fierce, brittle pride in her eyes that refused to be extinguished. He saw not a victim, but a survivor running out of time. He then looked past her, at the barren fields, the failing cabin, the oncoming winter in the bruised purple of the sky. "This land is too hard for one person," he stated, a simple fact. "And my house is too quiet. I have a proposition for you, Mrs. Thorne. Not charity. A contract." She braced herself, expecting a demand for servitude, a life as his housekeeper, indebted and voiceless. "I need an heir," he said, the words laid bare, without sentiment or softness. "I have built all of this," he gestured to the endless horizon, "for a son to carry my name. My bloodline ends with me. That is a failing I will not permit." He stepped closer, his shadow engulfing her. His gaze was intense, a forge where a new reality was being hammered into shape. "You are strong. You have survived what would have broken many. You understand this land. I will give you everything: shelter, security, a life free from fear and hunger. My name. All I ask in return is that you give me a child." Alara felt the breath leave her body, stolen by the sheer, brutal audacity of his words. It was a business transaction for the continuation of a legacy, the merging of two desperations. Hers for survival, his for permanence. He saw the shock on her face, the conflict warring in her eyes. He did not soften his tone. He spoke with the conviction of a man who dealt only in unshakable truths. "The arrangements will be made. You will come to my ranch before the first snow. By winter, you'll carry my son inside you." It was not a boast, nor a threat. It was a promise. A stark, solemn vow that sealed her fate to his, binding them together against the coming darkness. The Blackwood Ranch was not a home. It was a fortress, a sprawling, two-story house built of dark timber and thick river stone. It stood defiant against the vast, open country, its windows like vacant eyes watching the approach of winter. Alara felt impossibly small within its walls. The silence was heavier here than in her own desolate cabin, amplified by the high ceilings and the cavernous rooms filled with sturdy, masculine furniture. Silas had given her a room at the far end of the upstairs hall, a space larger than her entire cabin, with a soft bed and a window that looked out onto the endless, rolling sea of his land. It was a gilded cage, and in the first few days, the comfort it offered felt more like a brand than a blessing. They lived like ghosts orbiting one another. He rose before the sun, the sound of his boots on the floorboards the only sign of his passing. He spent his days on the range, a distant figure on horseback, working with an unyielding intensity that seemed to defy the limits of a mortal man. Their evenings were spent in the great room, a fire crackling in the massive stone hearth. They would eat in near silence, the clink of silverware against porcelain the only conversation. Alara had insisted on cooking, on earning her keep in some small, tangible way. It was an act of retaining some piece of herself. He accepted this without comment, but she noticed he ate every last bite of the simple, nourishing meals she prepared. He never offered praise, but his clean plate was its own form of communication. She began to study him in those quiet hours. She saw the exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes, the calluses on his hands that spoke of a lifetime of hard labor. His wealth was not an inheritance. It was something he had torn from this unforgiving land with his own two hands. She saw the way he stared into the fire, his expression unreadable but for a profound loneliness she recognized, for it was a mirror of her own. One evening, a week after her arrival, he came in from the cold, a dusting of early snow on the shoulders of his coat. He didn't speak, but walked to the hearth and placed a small, crudely carved wooden bird on the mantelpiece. He had been whittling it. The lines were simple, the shape imperfect, but there was a strange, tender grace to it. He did this without looking at her, then took his seat at the table. Alara's eyes kept drifting to the bird. It was a flicker of something unexpected, a crack in the granite facade. The next day, she found a thick wool shawl, softer than anything she had ever touched, folded neatly on her bed. There was no note. None was needed. It was an answer to the bird, a silent dialogue of provision and acknowledgement. She started to venture outside, first only to the porch, then to the corrals. She watched him work with the horses, his movements economical and sure. There was no brutality in his strength, only a deep, intuitive understanding of the animals. He spoke to them in a low, calm voice, a tone she had never heard him use with a person. She began to understand that his silence was not a sign of coldness, but a language of its own. Words, in this vast and empty place, were often unnecessary. The meaning was in the action, the mended fence, the chopped wood, the full pantry. He was a man who spoke through deeds, and his deeds said he would protect her. Her fear, the gnawing anxiety that had been her constant companion for a year, began to slowly recede. It was replaced by something else, a tentative sense of peace, as quiet and fragile as the first green shoots of spring under a layer of frost. The house began to feel less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. She started to take ownership of the space, airing out rooms that had been sealed for years, polishing the dark wood until it gleamed, placing jars of dried prairie flowers on the windowsills. She was breathing life back into the house, and in doing so, breathing it back into herself. One afternoon, he found her in the library, a room he never used, running her fingers over the spines of the leather-bound books. "My father's," he said from the doorway, making her jump. He thought a man should read. "Did you?" she asked, her voice soft. He shook his head. "This land is the only book I ever learned to read," he paused, his gaze lingering on her. "You should read them, if you like." It was the longest conversation they'd had. An offering, an invitation into a part of his past. That night, by the fire, she opened a book of poetry, and he did not retreat into his thoughts, but watched her, his expression holding a quiet curiosity. The space between them, once a chasm of silence, was now filled with a shared, comfortable quiet. The contract remained unspoken between them, a foundation of stone beneath the fragile structure of their new life, but the sharp edges of the arrangement were beginning to soften. They were no longer just two strangers bound by a desperate pact. They were two solitary souls learning the rhythm of a shared existence, finding a strange and unexpected solace in the shadow of the coming winter. The first true blizzard arrived with the ferocity of an invading army, a white wall of screaming wind and blinding snow that erased the world. For 3 days, the ranch was an island in a tempestuous sea of white. The windows rattled, the timbers of the great house groaned under the assault, but inside, a profound stillness held them. The storm forced them into a proximity that their daily routines had allowed them to avoid. There was no work to be done outside, no escaping to the far corners of the property. There was only the house, the fire, and each other. On the second day, a section of the stable roof, burdened by the immense weight of the snow, gave a sickening crack. Without a word, Silas pulled on his heaviest coat and went out into the maelstrom. Alara watched from the kitchen window, her heart a cold knot of fear as his form was swallowed by the swirling snow. He was gone for what felt like an eternity. She paced the length of the great room, the poetry book forgotten on her chair. The world outside was a furious, indifferent void, and he was alone in it. When he finally returned, he was a figure of ice, his eyebrows and beard caked in white, his face raw from the wind. He stumbled inside, bringing the storm with him, and collapsed into a chair by the fire, shivering violently. She was at his side in an instant, her hands working deftly to unbutton his frozen coat. His fingers were stiff and blue. "Your hands," she breathed, her voice tight with alarm. She knelt before him, taking his frozen hands in her own, chafing them gently, trying to will her own warmth into them. It was the first time they had touched with such deliberate intimacy. His hands were hard and calloused, a map of his life's labor, but in hers, they felt terribly vulnerable. He didn't pull away. He simply watched her, his stormy eyes clouded with exhaustion. She brought him a blanket and a mug of hot broth, her movements efficient and sure. She tended to him not as a duty, but with a deep, instinctual current of care that surprised them both. "The roof is braced," he said later, his voice raspy. "The animals are safe." He had risked his life for them, for the silent, breathing creatures under his protection. You were reckless, she said, her tone sharper than she intended. It was the fear speaking. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time the granite facade cracked wide open. He let her see the immense weight he carried, the burden of this vast empire that rested solely on his shoulders. There is no one else, he said, the admission a raw whisper. In that moment, she understood him completely. His isolation was not a choice. It was a consequence. He was as much a prisoner of this land as he was its king. The silence that fell between them now was different. It was not empty. It was filled with a new, unspoken understanding. The contract had been about an heir, about legacy. But the reality that was taking root between them was about partnership. Later that night, as the wind howled its mournful song, she found him standing by the great window, looking out at the white oblivion. She came to stand beside him, not touching, but close enough to share the warmth of her presence. Thomas used to say a storm was just the world washing itself clean, she said softly, speaking of her husband for the first time. Silas did not flinch from the name. He simply nodded, his gaze fixed on the storm. My father said it was the earth's way of reminding a man how small he is. He turned his head, his eyes meeting hers in the dim, flickering light from the fire. He was wrong. It shows you what's strong enough to stand. His gaze was heavy with meaning. He was not just talking about the house or the trees. He was talking about her. He was talking about them. In the heart of the blizzard, trapped together against the fury of the world, the promise he had made on her porch began to transform. It was no longer a cold, hard bargain. It was taking on the warmth of the fire that burned between them, the shape of a shared future, the quiet, resilient hope of something that was strong enough to stand. The walls of the fortress had become the arms of a home. The world that emerged after the blizzard was pristine and silent, cloaked in a deep, unbroken blanket of snow. The harsh angles of the land were softened, the world remade in glittering white. Inside the ranch house, the thaw was more profound. The fragile bridge built between Alara and Silas during the storm had solidified into something real and enduring. A quiet rhythm of partnership settled over their days. They worked together, moving with an economy of motion and an intuitive understanding that required few words. He taught her how to track animals in the snow, how to read the sky for signs of the next storm. She taught him the comfort of a home, the simple peace of a shared meal, the warmth of a mended coat laid out for him before he faced the dawn. One afternoon, the crunch of unfamiliar hooves in the snow broke the tranquility. It was Mr. Croft's buggy, struggling up the long drive, looking more pathetic and out of place than ever in the vast white landscape. A cold dread, a phantom of her past life, returned to Alara. Men like Croft did not visit without a purpose, and their purposes were never kind. Silas was in a far pasture, checking on a herd that had been cut off by the snow. She was alone. She met the banker on the porch, wrapping her new wool shawl tighter around her shoulders. It was a shield, a gift from the man whose name she now carried, and it gave her strength. "Mrs. Blackwood," Croft said, his tone a sneering mix of mock courtesy and genuine venom. "A fortunate turn of events for you." His eyes darted around, assessing the formidable ranch, the visible signs of wealth and power. Greed glittered in his gaze. "I've been reviewing the old Thorne property deeds," he went on, getting to his point. "It seems your late husband overlooked a mineral rights clause, an old silver claim, worthless then, perhaps, but with the new railroad coming through, its value could be substantial." Alara's blood ran cold. He was trying to steal the last remnant of her past, to poison the memory of Thomas with his avarice. A year ago, this threat would have shattered her. She would have crumbled into helpless tears. But the woman who faced him now was not the broken widow he remembered. She had been forged anew in the silence and hardship of this land. "That property belongs to my husband now," she said, her voice even and cold as the winter air. "Your business is with him." Croft laughed, a short, ugly sound. "My business is with a worthless claim on a dead man's land. Blackwood is a busy man. I'm sure he'd rather I deal with his sensitive new wife. A small settlement to avoid any legal unpleasantness would be in everyone's best interest. He took a step closer, his presence an oily stain on the clean snow. He might be the king of this valley, but even he has vulnerabilities. It was the way he looked at her then, as if she were a weakness, a liability to be exploited, that ignited the steel in her spine. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She drew herself up to her full height, her gaze direct and unflinching, channeling the unyielding strength of the man she had come to know. "There is nothing for you here, Mr. Croft," she said, her words dropping like chips of ice into the silence. "You are trespassing. Leave now." "Or what?" he sneered. "You'll have your husband throw me out." "No," came a low voice from behind him. Silas was there. He had approached on foot, his steps silent in the deep snow, a rifle held loosely in one hand. He hadn't come to rescue her. He had come to stand with her. His eyes were not on Croft. They were on Alara, and in them, she saw a fierce, burning pride. He had heard it all. He had seen her stand her ground. He had seen the queen of his fortress defending her gate. Silas shifted his gaze to the banker, and the sheer, glacial weight of it made Croft physically recoil. "She told you to leave," Silas said, his voice quiet but carrying the deadly promise of an avalanche. "That was your only warning." Croft scrambled back to his buggy, his greed consumed by a sudden primal fear. He fled, a dark coward disappearing into the white landscape. The silence returned, profound and absolute. Silas walked onto the porch and stood before Alara. He gently took the rifle from his own hands and leaned it against the wall, a deliberate act of peace, of laying down his arms before her. He looked at her, his expression more open and vulnerable than she had ever seen. The man of stone was letting her see the heart within. He had bought her survival with his money, but she had earned her place with her strength. He slowly raised a hand, not to his own chest, but to hers, his fingers gently brushing the soft wool of the shawl he had given her. It was a gesture of immense tenderness, an acknowledgement of everything that had passed between them without words. The contract was gone, dissolved and remade into a covenant. The promise had been fulfilled, not by a physical union, but by the forging of their spirits. They were partners. They were a family. That evening, as they sat by the fire, she looked out at the moonlit snow covering the land that was now theirs. She rested a hand on her stomach. Winter had come, and with it, the quiet, certain hope of a new spring. The promise he had made was no longer about a name or a legacy. It was about the life they would build together, a life strong enough to stand against any storm.